The Death That Never Comes. A Dharma Talk by the Backyard Buddhist. When we talk about death, most of us get a little uncomfortable. That's understandable. Death is one of the few experiences we all share, and yet it's also one of the great mysteries of human life. Every culture has wrestled with it. Every religion has tried to explain it. Every one of us, sooner or later, has to face it. I know I have. As some of you know, I spent many years serving as a Christian priest before finding my home in Buddhism. During those years, I stood beside hospital beds, sat with grieving families, and held the hands of people who knew their final days were near. And if I'm being completely honest, I carried many of the same questions they did. What happens when we die? What becomes of us? Does anything remain? Those questions didn't disappear when I became a Buddhist. In some ways, they became even deeper. Buddhism doesn't encourage us to settle for comforting answers. It asks us to look directly at our experience and investigate for ourselves. And over the years, I've come to believe something that might sound surprising. I don't think our greatest misunderstanding is about death. I think our greatest misunderstanding is about who we think is dying. Now, before anyone throws a meditation cushion or a mock talk at me, let me explain. Buddhism doesn't teach that death is unreal. Bodies age, bodies get sick, bodies die. Anyone who's watched a loved one pass away knows that these things are very real. But Buddhism does ask us to examine something carefully. Who is it that we imagine ourselves to be? Most of us spend our lives assuming there's a solid, permanent person living somewhere inside all this experience. We point to our memories and say, "That's me." We point to our thoughts and say, "That's me." We point to our emotions, our history, our personality, our accomplishments, and even our failures, and we say, "That's who I am." But the Buddha invites us to look a little closer. Your body today isn't the same body you had 10 years ago. Your thoughts aren't the same thoughts you had this morning. Your emotions shift from moment to moment. Your opinions change. Your desires change. Your fears change. Everything we normally identify as ourselves is constantly moving, constantly changing, constantly flowing. The Buddha summed this up very simply. All conditioned things are impermanent. When we hear that, it's easy to think he's talking about the world around us, but he's also talking about the person we think we are. And that's where things get interesting. Because if everything we call self is constantly changing, then what exactly is it that's supposed to die? That's not a trick question. It's one of the deepest questions Buddhism asks. Now, I want to be careful here. Some Buddhist traditions speak about awareness, others speak about Buddha nature. Some teachers talk about what they call the one who knows. But Buddhism is generally very cautious about turning any of those things into a soul or an eternal self. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is something you can notice right now. A thought appears, you know it. A feeling appears, you know it. Fear appears, you know it. Joy appears, you know it. Even thoughts about death are known. Everything comes and goes, but there is this simple knowing of experience. Ajahn Chah often pointed students back toward this direct recognition. He said, "The heart that knows is released." I've always loved that expression. Not the heart that believes, not the heart that argues, not the heart that wins theological debates, the heart that knows. When I sit zazen and thoughts about death arise, I notice something curious. The thoughts may be frightened, the stories may be frightened, the ego may be frightened, but awareness itself doesn't seem frightened at all. It simply knows. And that observation leads us into an interesting conversation with modern science. Because in its own way, science has also begun questioning many of our assumptions about the self. For centuries, people thought of death as a single event. One moment you're alive, the next moment you're dead. But biology tells a more complicated story. Death is actually a process. Cells continue functioning for a time. Different systems shut down at different rates. The boundary isn't nearly as sharp as we once imagined. At the same time, neuroscience has begun suggesting that what we call the self may be less like a permanent thing and more like an ongoing process. In other words, the solid person we assume ourselves to be may be more fluid than we think. Now, science and Buddhism aren't saying exactly the same thing. Science studies mechanisms. Buddhism studies experience. But it's fascinating that both seem to point toward a similar insight. The self may not be nearly as fixed as we imagine. And if that's true, perhaps death looks different than we think it does. Not because we're immortal, not because some permanent soul survives unchanged, but because the separate self we've spent our lives defending may never have been as solid as we believed. Now, I want to be careful here. When Buddhists speak about awareness, Buddha nature, or what some teachers call the knowing mind, we're not talking about an immortal soul hiding somewhere inside us. In fact, one of the Buddha's most radical teachings was that no such permanent self can be found. When we look carefully, what we call self appears to be a constantly changing process. A body formed through causes and conditions, thoughts arising through causes and conditions, feelings arising through causes and conditions, memories arising through causes and conditions, everything appearing for a time and then passing away. The Buddha called this dependent origination. Nothing exists independently. Nothing stands alone. Nothing possesses an unchanging essence. The person I was at 20 isn't the person I am today. And yet, there's continuity. The flame of a candle at midnight isn't the same flame that burned at sunset. Yet neither are they completely separate. This is one reason Buddhism speaks differently about death than many religions. The question isn't whether an immortal soul survives. The Buddha never taught that. Instead, Buddhism asks us to examine the very idea of a permanent self in the first place. When we do, something surprising happens. The self we thought needed protecting begins to look less substantial than we imagined. Not because we're nothing, and not because we don't exist, but because we exist as a relationship, as a process, as an unfolding event, as the meeting place of countless causes and conditions that have come together, for a little while, to produce what I call me. When I look at myself this way, death begins to appear differently. The body will certainly die. The personality I've spent a lifetime constructing will pass away. My memories, preferences, opinions, and habits will all come to an end. But those things were never fixed or permanent to begin with. They've been changing from the moment I was born. In a very real sense, what I call Darren has already died countless times. The child is gone. The young man is gone. The priest is gone. The person who sat his first Zazen period 30 years ago is gone. And yet here I am, not the same, not entirely different. Just this ongoing stream of causes and conditions continuing to unfold. That's why I sometimes say that death is an illusion. Not because bodies don't die, they do. Not because a soul escapes the body and lives forever. Buddhism doesn't teach that. Rather, death appears differently once we realize that the separate, enduring self we imagine ourselves to be was never there in quite the way we thought. What dies is real, but perhaps the owner of that death was always a story.